If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, explorers, outdoors people, what are our scariest stories exploring dark woods, abandoned cabins, ruins, etc. When I was younger, probably 10 years old, I was staying a couple days at my stepmother's little brother's house. We're about the same age. One day we went behind the neighborhood to walk or explore in the woods in an undeveloped area. After about 5 minutes, we both kind of stopped each other and held each other back, and we were like, "What's that?" Because we thought we saw a man just standing in the woods, maybe 100 feet away. We looked for another few seconds before we realized it was some type of giant bird sitting on a tree that had fallen over. We both turned around and took off running. This thing was probably 5 feet tall and had a human head or face that was red. The body was black. Years and years went by, and I never talked about it or saw anything like it again. I decided to bring it up at a get-together we were having one night, to make sure I wasn't crazy or something, and we both described the exact same thing exactly as I remembered it. I was worried that he wasn't going to remember it at all, but 20 years later, after never talking about it to each other, we both remembered it exactly the same. This happened in a primarily Mexican South Texas town, and we were told that it may have been a la chusa, which is a Mexican folklore of an owl witch that has human features. Side note, my dad swears for his life that he saw a lechuza one night on a power line or pole in this same town when he was younger. I remember talking to my mom about it, and she was like, "Your dad said he saw something like that when we first started dating." They've been separated since I was 1 year old. I thought it was crazy that my mom still remembered that story from him. I was solo camping and on a hike to my favorite spot. I saw what looked like a man holding a massive rock in one hand and a knife in the other, facing me. This was pretty weird, but other bushcrafters have been known to camp there too, so I gave the standard "hey man" shout and wave. I got a bit closer, and it looked like it was just a rock. I laughed it off and turned around, staring at the road. A rock whizzed by my right ear, fast enough and big enough to really hurt me if it hit me. I turned around to where the rock had come from, and the figure I'd seen wasn't there anymore. My friend and I were walking home from school one day. We took a different path than usual, and we stumbled upon someone's house. It was one of those isolated homes, surrounded by forest on all sides. I noticed something white on the edge of the lawn as we passed. I took a look at it, and it looked like half of a human pelvis. I asked my friend, who hunts, what he thought, and he said it didn't look like a deer or coyote. As we were studying it, the homeowner stormed out of his house and started to chase us. And I mean really chase us. For a good half-mile or so, until we lost him. It was more than just trying to chase us away, I think he was trying to get us. We never told anyone at the time. I tell the story now, over a decade later, and people think I'm bullshitting. I just hope my friend was wrong and the guy was just a ducking loon with animal bones on his lawn. I grew up in a small valley in the mountains. No matter where you looked, you would be encased in mountains. The valley had its fair share of children my age too. There were about 30 children in my class growing up. Despite the number of children my age, I never got along with any of them. Since then, I've always been fond of the forest. By the time I was 15, I had been to every part and knew it by heart. Through all of these years of spending hours a day in the forest, I never saw anything I could call weird or out of place. When I was 16, people began to cut down the forest. I'm not sure why, but since I was the only one enraged by this, I assumed it was bound to happen. So, I'd still spend time in those, but it was nowhere near as fun. I remember hearing that the company cutting down the trees quit for no reason. They refused to specify why they'd quit, but I'm grateful they stopped as my favorite tree remained standing. It would have been cut if they hadn't stopped. I still kept doing my regular walks through the forest, but this time I would always be followed by a sense of dread. One specific day during late August, I had an argument with my family. This was a regular thing, so I went off to the mountain to just walk and calm down. Since my parents go to sleep relatively early, at 9 p.m., and it would remain light until 10 p.m. during the summer, I decided I'd stay until about 9 p.m. and get home by 9:30 p.m. It was about 8:45 when I sat down by my favorite tree for a cigarette. Yes, I know smoking is bad for you, especially starting at such a young age, but at the time I couldn't have cared less. I lit my cigarette and put the lighter down next to my feet. The sense of dread came, but by this point I knew how to ignore it or just drown it out with music. It was getting dark, but only a little. I looked down to a part of the forest where a small stream ran through and sheep usually roamed. If you'd go a bit onward from there, you can find this awesome rock. It's huge. As I stared and contemplated going to the rock after my break, I saw something move. It was tall, I could tell that as it moved through the trees, but I couldn't make out what it was. Before I could realize that whatever I was witnessing was probably supposed to scare me, it was gone. Odd, but I ignored it. About 10 minutes later, I decided to head to the rock. It would be an easier journey home if I did, and I got to see the cool rock, so what's the harm? Well, a lot of harm. I cut through some trees and down a slope, then I followed the stream down. I passed where I saw the shadow move, and the sense of dread became overbearing. My mind ran back to the shadow I saw wandering, and I tried to shake it off, not being a believer in the paranormal. I thought, even if the paranormal were real, if they roamed this forest, I certainly would have noticed sooner. I spent my whole childhood up here. I came towards the rock and climbed on top of it like usual. There's a stunning view of the mountains if you know what trees to look through. What I least expected to see was the shadow. It moved quite slowly, as if being careful. Now I had a good sense of its size due to it being a lot closer than before. It was tall and deer-like, but it stood on its back legs and had human hands. A pair of long and winding antlers stood on top of its head. Once it noticed me, it stood still and stared. Standing on the rock usually makes me feel tall, but I never felt smaller than during that moment. We stood there, both still, for a moment. The creature began to move towards me faster than when it had been exploring. I stumbled off the rock and landed awkwardly on my ankle. I groaned in pain, knowing it was sprained at the very least. I'd sprained my ankle before and recognized the pain. The creature didn't pity my state, it kept moving towards me. We were now face to face. Somehow, despite the fact that it was still supposed to be somewhat light for a couple more hours, the forest became dark. I stared the creature in the face. Oh, how I wish I hadn't. If I hadn't looked at its face, I wouldn't have seen those small red eyes or that mouth. The mouth was the worst. It was large and wide, with many sharp, pointy teeth all out of place. They were stained yellow and had traces of blood on the canines. This creature was not friendly. I scrambled to my feet, and as I did, it swung its arm for me, barely missing. I turned my phone torch on and sprinted away, not even daring to look back. I never wanted to see whatever the hell that was again. I got to an opening, and it was light again. I was confused and turned back, the creature backing away into its dark patch of forest. I don't hesitate to run home, and I go straight to my room. My ankle was still in a lot of pain, so I just stayed in bed while rummaging through my bag for the painkillers I always carried around. When night came, I was too disturbed to sleep. I heard a scraping noise outside my window, and my mind ran to all of the worst possible ideas. Even so, I looked out, and there it was. Those horrible teeth and everything. I quickly turned on my bedroom light, limping to my light switch, of course, and it ran away. I've learned something important: it hates light. Since then, it has followed me to dark places. I have to keep a flashlight on me, and I keep a small lamp by my window to scare it away. But I know that one day it will get me, and I am terrified of it. So, learn from me. If you are exploring nature and you feel a sense of dread, leave. You don't know what you may find. There was a single family home that had been abandoned for over a decade in my hometown. The story of why that place was abandoned varied depending on who was telling it, but I found out by doing a bit of research that an old man committed suicide after his wife of 40 to 50 years passed away in his arms of a heart attack while waiting for emergency crews to arrive. The house was cleaned and rented out by the family, only to have the renters move out within a week or so. This happened several times over a few years until the family sold the home, and the family who bought it ended up moving out within a month. The house ended up getting minor fire damage shortly after and became foreclosed and abandoned. Well, of course, after some time, local kids started to break into the place and vandalize it. Me and a friend decided we were going to check the place out and see if it really was as haunted as the stories told. 3 rolls of 35mm film from the investigation failed to develop. Not because the film was bad, but because every single frame was full of a white mist. Our analog tape recorder recorded several clips of an old man telling us to leave. In the bedroom where it all went down, the room temperature was 68 degrees Fahrenheit, even though it was Florida in July in a home that had not had power AC since the early 80s. As we packed up to leave, a semi-transparent man appeared in a hallway with a shotgun pointing at us, and we noped out immediately. I had another friend go back to retrieve our left bags and never return. The place was torn down about 15 years ago so a shopping center could be built, and from my understanding, employees of the various shops near that old house say they can feel odd presences and almost hear a man's voice telling them to leave. Strange things in the woods. I was a sophomore in high school when this happened. I haven't gone back. It's midsummer in New England, and my best friend, let's call him Anthony, and I are hanging out. I live on conservation land, so aside from the houses at the very front, there are no other developments and woodland that spans for acres and acres. The state laid down some paths, so I suggested that we go exploring. We geared up, I brought my pocket knife, sprayed down with bug spray, and headed out to my backyard. We hadn't explored too much, but I knew the area somewhat well, so we decided to go to hell with the trails. We're going to be real men and forge our own path. We enter the woods, thickly forested with pine, maple, and oak trees, and make notches in the trees on the way so we can find our way back. It's around noon, so I'm not too worried about it getting dark. After all, the sun sets around 8 p.m. in the summer, but just in case we walk deeper and deeper into the woods for about 15 minutes, and the forest is alive. Bugs, frogs, birds, everything in this forest is loud and slightly irritating, to be honest, but it's nice to take in the sights and sounds. Soon, we stumble upon a peculiar scene. A perfect circle is probably 20 feet in diameter and spans from the ground all the way to the sky. I'm perplexed, but Anthony is curious, so we decide to go in. The first thing I noticed is that the overgrown weeds and grass that surround us stop at the perimeters. All vegetation past the line is dead, not bare, but dead, crunching under our feet. I don't just mean the grass, but the tree limbs that extend in are also bare. Leaves down the branch until it crosses the line. Being the middle of summer, nothing should be dead, and I've never seen a branch behave like that. I am feeling extreme unease. I turn to Anthony and ask him if he feels uneasy. He says he feels like we're being watched. I agree. It's then that we notice the strangest sense. The entire forest has gone silent. Not in rest but in what feels like suspense. I'm feeling very uneasy now, and I know that we need to leave. We run out of there following our tree marks, and when we get back to my house, the forest is alive. Ever since then, every summer and every winter, a snarl of branches, sometimes leafed, sometimes not, reveals our path through the forest. I swear that whatever was watching us from that circle peers through and wants us to come back. I used to live an hour away from Gettysburg and would explore the battlefield with friends late at night. Several times, we saw nothing but one summer night in July of 2010. We experienced so much. Our group saw giant orbs swinging lanterns in the woods and has recordings of loud horses galloping and people whispering. You can hear the yips of two men saying, "Bob, is that her? What did you do to that poor girl?" Later on, we recorded multiple women's voices trying to identify someone else, saying such things as, "Is it Malviki? It's that girl Rayana." There were two women, including myself, in the group and two guys, so I'm not really sure what the spirits were referring to. Also, when we were walking through the wheat field, my friend asked out loud if there was anyone in the woods, and both he and I heard a loud voice whisper in our ear, "No." It was super creepy. It was almost as if the ghost was being sarcastic. In addition, I also have an EVP recording of someone saying, "Help me." That night felt like everywhere we went was a paranormal experience, and I also heard Indian tom-tom drums in the woods and the distant echoes of cannon fire. Whatever was out there followed us around because the whole night there was this white misty cloud nearby. I also saw muzzle flashes and smelled tobacco smoke. One of the most incredible experiences of my life. I've gone back multiple times since, and nothing has happened. My friend and I used to sneak into cemeteries at night. This was about 2 years ago. We didn't do anything too purposefully disrespectful, we would just sneak in past or around midnight. We were there in the middle of the night, morning, exploring one of the cemeteries we would frequent, and we heard something run after us. It was pretty scary. It could have been a guard trying to kick us out, or it could have been nothing, or it could have been something else, we don't know, but basically we left running. I don't remember how long after, but somehow my mom figured out that we had visited. I really have no idea how she found out because I don't share my location with her and I don't recall telling her where we went. She told me that she had a vision and saw that a male figure in a maroon or purple, I think, shirt was looking at me while I was there. She told me not to go back. I don't know if she was telling me to scare me so I wouldn't go back or if it was real, but I never went back. When I was about 7 to 8 years old, my best friend and I would go out and explore the woods behind his house almost regularly, until one day in the fall. We were on a trail, and all the leaves had fallen off the trees and were scattered all over the ground. Even though we were in a heavily forested area, we could still see a couple hundred feet in every direction as the trunks of many trees were small and very thin, with the exception of a few extremely large trees, such as oaks and maples. It was a bright, clear, sunny day, so there was no darkness or shadows. As we walked down the trail and past a very thickly trimmed maple tree, a partridge took off, scaring the hell out of both of us as it was only a few feet beside us on the other side of the tree. We both spun around and ran like hell for about 40 to 50 feet up the path. As I turned around, I saw a man with short black hair and a thin beard standing there. After we stopped running, I turned around, and he was gone. As I said, this was the only extremely large truck tree for 7100 around, and there was nowhere else to hide. My friend looked at me and asked if I saw the guy standing there. I said I did. We both called out, but no one responded or replied back. This was back in the 1970s, so we were not as creeped out by perverts or the type of people we have around today. So we walked back to apologize to him, as we thought we had probably scared the snot out of him as well. As we approached the tree, I went around one side and my buddy went around the other, and as we rounded it, we discovered no one was there and there was absolutely no place to hide. At this time, we both decided to run back home. As we returned home, neither of us talked about it, as we were both now two legitimately freaked out 8-10-year-old kids. Again, we said nothing to each other and never once spoke of it to our parents, because we were a lot farther than we were supposed to be and we did not want to get grounded. I work in a typical office park in Maryland. A few years back, I noticed the state had cleared the woods as there was an old slave graveyard and they were marking it for historical record. You would never know it was there. A week later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, I decided to explore and see what was up. There were about half a dozen headstones not marked with any names. And probably a dozen more that were in major disrepair. Broken, or just pieces of markers left. I was taking it all in from the center of the graveyard. I don't know if I was standing on a grave, as it wasn't clear or that organized. Suddenly, I was being buzzed by a large flying thing. I say thing as it was moving so fast I could not lock my eyes into it. My mind registered something the size of a bird. But it was a blur that made no noise and just danced around me so fast in a true blur. For less than a minute. Then gone. This is the middle of the day, and my eyes aren't slow. But it was a blur. Okay, I said. Suddenly, I felt a hand. Actually, 3 long distinct fingers grasped my right shoulder from the rear. And pull me back enough to turn my body about 1/8 of a turn. Okay. I'm out. I apologized to all there. And rolled out. Now, back in my days as an officer, I've seen some spooky stuff go down. Occasional unexplained phenomena, impossible occurrences, bizarre creatures, and hundreds of other things. However, one that sticks with me was when I went to patrol a small area in Illinois known as Ursa. This was in 2012, so maybe a couple thousand people were living there, but that was enough people to have their own urban legend, aka the Screamer. Now, the Screamer was supposedly a man who would randomly appear near abandoned buildings and let out a scream that would forever ring through your soul, a never-ending, piercing scream. Supposedly. I, of course, thought that this was ludicrous mumbo-jumbo. A screaming man appearing out of thin air? Absolutely not. Not even in my wildest dreams. But I was eventually proven wrong. Now, in Ursa, there is an extremely unknown location known as Dwight's Pool, a very serene, remote pond with a small asylum facing away from it, towards the main town. I was sent there by the local dispatch team, I was a floater at the time, to check out 2 reports of a man with a weird mask watching young couples swim from the tree line. My first thought was, Valp, we've got ourselves another creep, and I believed myself to be right, as well as my temporary partner Ricky. He and I got out there immediately, as the town was too small for a constant watch. Well, it's around 8:45 p.m., and the pool is eerily foggy and dark. We have flashlights, but they were unable to penetrate the thick fog. I told Ricky that I'd check out the asylum and its surroundings. He agreed, but not before long he began acting strangely. Winger, I'm getting a weird feeling. We need backup, don't go near that asylum. Now, when you hear your own partner say stuff like that, you definitely need to take it seriously, especially as an officer of the law. He calls in backup while I watch the asylum, just waiting for something to happen. I literally gasp as I see the figure of an incredibly large man emerge from the roof of the building. The building was at least 300 feet away from us, so that's what makes this part so much stranger. The figure stands as tall as it can and begins talking in a low, mumbled tone, "Please, leave." The figure, as I said, was at least 300 feet away. However, when it said those words, its voice seemed to be pressed right against our ears. Ricky and I booked it out of there and back to the local station. Backup arrived for us later, but we were too shaken up to continue our duty. We found out later that when the dispatchers searched the asylum, they found a camera and an old lantern. Nothing else. Anyway, this was definitely one of the weirder experiences I've had during my time as a patrol officer. It is but one of several odd stories I have, and trust me, in the line of duty, things just keep getting weirder and weirder. It's been 20 years since my friends walked into those dank halls of the abandoned stone church and never returned. My town wasn't as small as some rural towns, but our population couldn't have exceeded 5,000, and there was so much field to play in. The biggest curiosity among the school kids, however, was the abandoned church that sat lonely among the overgrown grass. Kids at school would whisper that the church left money behind and that it was ripe for exploration, but we were all too scared to set foot near that place. There were condemned and no trespassing signs everywhere, and when we asked the adults, they said that the building had asbestos and lead paint, so it wasn't safe to run around. But in October of 2003, my dumbass friends decided that they were going to be the first to explore, pillage, and uncover the truth of the desecrated grounds, and that on the night of the full moon, Halloween, we would go there and see what the place had to offer. I declined, as getting lung cancer at the age of 13 was a big no for me. My friends said I was chicken, but I wasn't going in there, it was creepy and dangerous. They all went without me, and that was the last night I ever saw them. For a whole year after that, I was interrogated by police, worried sick parents, and even some local news media. I remember my friends fondly. Bella, my old flame, is smart and energetic. Kyle is the dumbest ass in our group, he is slow thinking but good meaning. Lastly, there was Billy, the only one in the group who I knew before we met Bella and Kyle. When I turned 27, I got out of the state and started a new life elsewhere. It didn't really work out, things have been rough financially, I can't get a girlfriend, and I am terrible at talking to people. Having nowhere else to go, I went back to my old childhood town because I was going to figure out once and for all what the hell happened to my friends. I drove through my town, it's not too different from my childhood. Driving down the road, I saw it out my window, the church still standing with overgrowth and ominous energy. It was still early in the morning, and I didn't want to waste any sunlight. Plus, going into town meant I might run into somebody, and I wasn't here to catch up with people. I drove down the dirt road that cut through the grassy plains and arrived at the cathedral with the rising sun behind it. I paused for a moment, both to get my things and to steel my courage. I grabbed a flashlight and a pistol I carry with me and walked in the direction of the church. I had my phone, but I wasn't about to film myself trespassing. It wasn't enormous, but it was definitely sizable. I had 3 whole floors to get through, including the basement. I opened the door, and the light almost vanished in the Vana black abyss on the other side. I turned on my flashlight and shined it down the hall where the stairs to the second floor were. Then I shined it on the stairs that lead to the subterranean level, and then I turned my light to my side and shined it down the gathering hall. The pews still stood with Bibles in the back sleeves of each row. I walked through the murk and up to the stage, where I could see a half-empty bottle of wine and a knocked-over goblet. I was starting to get a theory in my head but didn't pay attention to it, mostly because I didn't want it to be true. After a short investigation of the hall, I went upstairs, where the offices were. When I got to the second floor, I found 2 doors. The first one I went through was full of documents and unremarkable stuff, just budgets and plans. Then I opened one of the office drawers, and amazingly enough, I found money, a stack of Benjamins, even. I guess the rumors were true. But that also means my theory is true. Whoever was here left in a damn hurry. Beneath the money, I found a key and later found that it went to the adjacent door down the hall. I went in, and what I found was alarming, to say the least. A skeleton slumped over the table. In one hand, he had a bottle of whiskey and, in the other, a revolver. I took the gun, no bullets, but still a nice piece. There was also a note on the floor by his feet. I picked it up, and what I read was vague and disturbing. I never wanted it to come to this, I thought what we were doing was holy, and I was willing to do anything to see our Savior reborn into this world. But this blood on our hands, and this thing we summoned. I can't blood splatter made the second part of the letter ineligible, and I am starting to get the feeling that the cops never investigated this place. I had to know for sure what happened to my friends and who in town knew more than they were letting on. There was only one more floor to investigate, the basement. As I walked down the stairs, I could feel myself descending into madness in real time. Why didn't the police thoroughly investigate this place? What did they do? Are my friends even dead? As soon as I got to the basement, I got my answer. On the floor was the skeleton of a child, and across the hallway was a barred door. When I approached it, I was sent back by a loud bang. My heart raced as something threw itself against the doors on the other side. The old wooden bar holding the door shut was too old and moldy to hold and began to break. As a bit of the door opened, I could see a long tongue emerging from the breaches in the door, and when I saw it, I turned around and ran straight for the exit. By the time I ran up the stairs, I heard the doors bust open, and I ran so fast for the door that I thought I was going to take flight. When I got out of there, I ran to my car and looked back. There it was on the other side of the door, unmoving and cloaked in shadows. The only feature I saw was a grin full of razor-sharp teeth that I swore were made of iron. It turned around, and I watched its body coil back into the shadows until all that remained was its tail, then nothing. I was sure of 3 things. 1, that thing doesn't like sunlight. 2, of my friends were dead. And 3, I can't trust anyone in my town anymore. I got in my car and drove as far away as I could. I'd always been an avid explorer. My house was on the outskirts of town, bordering a massive forest. I went for hikes every once in a while to clear my head. Usually, I would choose a different path each time. That was until I found a small wooden cabin that had clearly been abandoned. The door was missing, the wood was rotting, and it was overgrown. The first time I stumbled upon it, I was unprepared. Usually, I carried a knife and some pepper spray with me when I explored these places, just for my own protection. You never know who might be hiding in there. I didn't have any of it with me that day, though, since I hadn't planned on anything more than a short walk. Besides, I hate to admit it, but something about that cabin shook me. As soon as I laid eyes on it, my heart beat faster than it ever had before. My whole body was jittery. So I left. I went back home and tried to forget about it. But I didn't forget about it. The next few days, I couldn't focus on my work. I couldn't do anything. My mind was consumed with the thought, what could possibly be in there? Soon, the thoughts took over my sleep. At first, I dreamed about the cabin, but I would wake up in a cold sweat before I could step inside. Then the thoughts progressed to the point where I was unable to sleep at all. Exactly a week after first discovering the cabin, I decided it was time. I was going to finally see for myself what was hiding in there. With the knife and pepper spray safely tucked away in my belt, I set off on my journey, retracing my steps from 7 days before. My pulse rose higher and higher as I got closer to the cabin. When I finally saw it again, it appeared exactly as it had on my previous visit. I walked in through the empty doorway. The floorboards made loud creaks with every step. The first room was completely empty. An orange glow shone through a door on my right that was hanging on by one hinge. My palms covered in sweat, I pushed the door aside. The source of the glow was a set of 5 identical candles sitting upright on the floor. It's a miracle this place hasn't burned down, I thought to myself. One by one, I picked up the candles and blew them out. As I was about to put out the last one, something red on the wall caught my eye. I raised the candle near the wall, using the light to inspect further. Written on the wall over and over again was a name, Peter Sherrill. My name. The candle slipped through my fingers and fell onto the floor, but I didn't need it anymore. Even without the light, I could now clearly see my own name written in blood on every inch of this room's walls. I instinctively stomped out the fire on the floor, still processing what I had just seen. Tears fell from my eyes as I struggled to comprehend the meaning of this cabin. I tried to walk out of the cabin, to leave it behind, and to pretend this never happened. But something in my own head told me that no, I had to stay. There was more to this place than just the writing. There was something else that I needed to see. Maybe it was my own instinct. Maybe it was some mysterious force that science can't explain. Whatever it was convincing enough that I turned around and went further into the house. At the back of the cabin, there was a staircase heading down. I didn't know where it led, but again, something in my own head told me to continue. So I did. Further and further down. The staircase was now made entirely of stone and lit by torches on the walls. When I arrived at the bottom, I was met with laughter. A man stood ahead of me with his back turned. He had long hair that clearly hadn't been cared for in years. He was thin and decrepit. I stood frozen in place, even as every natural instinct in my mind was telling me to run. The man turned around. What I saw, standing directly in front of me, was my own face. My own body me. The only difference was that he was clearly older by a few years. But his eyes, his nose, everything, he was absolutely, unmistakably me. I stood in place, jaw dropped, for what seemed to be an eternity. How is this possible? The sound of my heartbeat echoed through my entire body, drowning out everything else. The ground felt uneven, and the basement began to spin around me. My vision started to fade. It was only when I noticed the knife in his hand that my mind snapped out of its broken state and my body allowed me to move. I had to act fast, so what were my options? I could have stayed put, but this person, or this thing, that was imitating me showed no signs of being peaceful. I could have run, but what if he caught up to me? With my mind clouded by panic, I could only think of one other viable choice. I quickly unclipped the pepper spray from my belt and squirted it directly into his eyes. Into my eyes? I had half expected it to hurt myself as well, but it didn't. The older version of me covered his face and stumbled backward. I had an opportunity, and I got the duck out of there. I never went exploring that part of the forest again. I've always been fascinated by the supernatural and drawn to the eerie and unexplained. So, when I heard about a haunted house in my small town, I couldn't resist investigating. The rumors whispered of a sinister presence that lingered within, waiting to ensnare unsuspecting souls. The abandoned mansion stood at the edge of the woods. It had been vacant for decades, shrouded in a web of mystery and tales of inexplicable happenings. Determined to unveil the truth, I embarked on a journey into the heart of fear. As I approached the front gate, a cold gust of wind sent a chill down my spine. The rusty hinges creaked in protest as I pushed open the gate, their eerie screech cutting through the silence of the night. Every step I took reverberated with anticipation, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Entering the mansion, I was enveloped by a suffocating darkness that seemed to consume the very air I breathed. The air was heavy with an otherworldly presence, and an acrid smell permeated the atmosphere. I flicked on my flashlight, its feeble beam carving through the impenetrable blackness. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I explored the decrepit rooms, each one whispering secrets from a forgotten past. In one room, I stumbled upon a collection of faded photographs. Faces frozen in time stared back at me. I descended into the basement, a place where darkness reigned supreme. The staircase groaned under my weight, protesting my descent into the abyss below. A putrid stench grew stronger with each step, seeping into my very being. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a chamber bathed in an ethereal glow. The walls were adorned with occult symbols, each pulsating with an unholy energy. An ancient tome lay open on an altar, its pages adorned with cryptic text. Drawn to its forbidden knowledge, I reached out to touch it. Suddenly, a bone-chilling breeze enveloped me, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into impenetrable darkness. The whispers of 1,000 lost souls filled my ears, their tormented cries echoing through the void. A presence materialized before me, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes that bore into my very soul. Frozen with terror, I watched as the figure extended a skeletal hand towards me. It spoke in a voice that dripped with malevolence, each word a venomous dagger. "Leave this place or become one with us, forever trapped in this house of eternal anguish." I mustered the last remnants of my courage and stumbled backward, fleeing the basement and the horrors that lurked within. As I burst through the front door, the mansion let out an ear-splitting shriek, a cry of anguish and anger that reverberated through the night. Since that fateful night, I've been plagued by haunting visions and nightmares. The ghostly whispers continue to echo in my mind, a constant reminder of the horrors I witnessed. I am forever changed, a fragment of my former self lost to the shadows of that cursed mansion. If you ever find yourself in my small town, do not be lured by the siren song of the haunted house. The evil. I worked security at this college, and they had me patrol at 3 a.m. Now, I didn't mind, and the scariest places on campus weren't awful, but this one time, I was definitely creeped out. The night before, I decided to watch The Grudge with my buddy, and that freaked me out for the rest of the day. I wake up the next morning around 2:20 a.m., get dressed, and go to work. When I got to the campus, the dispatcher had me patrol inside a couple of the facilities. Before I even got to the first building, I was walking and kept hearing rustling in the bushes. I looked around and saw nothing, but right as I arrived at the first building, I looked down one of the walkways between two of the buildings and saw this tall, long-haired, dark-headed individual just standing 25 yards away from me. I began to call out to it to see if it was just some college kid, but there was no answer. Without a second thought, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction, but no one was there. I looked around for a bit, but I just thought to myself that I saw a shadow. I opened the front door of the first building and checked everything like usual. Because of the size of the building, I couldn't turn the lights on from anywhere close, so I usually patrolled in the dark. That morning, nothing was out of place, and I was able to make it out in pretty good time. I would always use the elevator to get to each floor, so once I was done, I took the elevator to the ground floor, did emergency phone checks on both, and walked to my last assignment for the building. Once I finished checking the north wing of the building, I walked back to the entrance until I heard a loud bell sound come from the elevator. This noise is always rung when the elevator reaches a floor, but I previously looked at both elevators and saw they were already on the ground floor. Without looking behind me, I ran straight up to the front doors in the lobby. Once I was safely out, I flashed my light inside to check, but there was nobody there, and the elevator doors were all shut. This had never happened before. While it was creepy, I still managed to keep my composure and move on to the next task. Once I reached the other building, I did the same things as I had previously done with the other building. For this particular facility, it is a well-known fact that the inside makes noise. It was always creepy in the beginning, but you would get used to it. However, this morning was different. After I finished checking all of the exterior doors, I made a quick elevator phone check and began to walk out when I heard this loud thump from upstairs. I grabbed my flashlight and started to yell out, "Hello?" multiple times, but there was no answer. At this point, I was scared out of my mind, so I made my way to the exit when I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the same strange figure I saw in the walkway up top on the second floor peering down at me. The same very tall figure with long, dark hair, this time with a white gown. After seeing her or it, I feel my teeth start to chatter, and I run out of the building all the way to the security office and report my findings. My dispatcher only shrugged it off, but I was still terrified for the next couple of hours until daylight. Firstly, a little background for those of you who have never heard of the Black Shuck. Here, in Norfolk, England, we have a local legend of an enormous ghost dog, or demon hound, who is thought to have originated from Viking and Saxon beliefs of the wild hunt, that stalks the woods and coastal areas of rural Norfolk. There have been accounts recorded as far back as 1127, but by far the most famous would be a night in August of 1577 when two churches came under attack from the creature. First was the Church of Blithburgh in Suffolk, where, according to legend, in a great clap of thunder, an enormous, shaggy black dog with a single, fiery eye like that of a cyclops burst through the church doors during a service. In a wild fury, it charged between the pews, killing a man and a small boy in the process. Its rampage ended with the steeple of the church collapsing through the roof. To this day, you can still see claw marks scorched into the northern door of the church. One morning in the summer of 2005, they were out in the woodland close to, at the time, our home village of Tunstead, North Norfolk. It was a hot day, and there is a stream that flows through the woods of this particular area off of Anchor Street that we were all fond of exploring, being in our early teens. As they got a little further, passing the shell of an abandoned car we used as a landmark, they heard a loud crashing sound coming from the surrounding trees. No sooner than the moment they had spun around to search for the source of the noise, a huge black dog, which my brother would later describe as looking similar to an enormous boar hound, dashed into the clearing. They would later describe to me that it stood at least 4 feet 5 inches at the shoulder with pure black fur and enormous, dark crimson eyes that sat unnaturally in its head. Fearing for their lives, they both started to run in the opposite direction, clearing the stream, a width of around 6 feet, in a single leap. Such was their fear. The dog apparently stopped at the river's edge before turning and disappearing back into the woods on the other side. Could this have been the Shuck? Or maybe the dog of a local farmer patrolled the woodland? Neither of them are sure, but they both say they have never seen a dog of its likeness anywhere else before. I am an urban explorer, along with a group of my friends. So one day, I found myself walking at the crack of dawn to the local train station. It was there that I met up with George. George was the oldest out of the 4 of us. He also acted that way. He gave off an older brother kind of air of protectiveness, especially around me. All of us took a train to this place. We got off, but there was an hour-long hike ahead of us after this. We could have rented a car or a taxi, but George wanted to stretch his legs, and I couldn't blame him given how he must have felt cooped up after all this time. George took a look at the sun and said, "Let's try to wrap this up before sunset." He was probably saying so for my sake, but I reassured him that I had a flashlight even if it got dark. The place we were going to was an abandoned farmhouse. Part of it had collapsed, but Jack told us that it was safe. That wasn't much of a reassurance, and neither was the story that Jack told us about the place. So yeah, the story goes that a family that lived here all died mysteriously one day, he said. And then a few years later, the family who bought it afterward also died within a week of each other. Then there is this story of 2 men who went missing. Knock it off, Jack, George said. Jack kind of had this habit of telling us that nearly every single place we explored was haunted, usually to freak Mary out, but he swore that this time it was real and he wasn't making it up. We spent some time wandering around the farm, and I have to say that it was quite beautiful. With our outdoor exploration done and the sun rapidly descending, we then decided to actually go inside. There was nothing overtly creepy about the place. As it began to get dark, George made sure that we didn't wander anywhere that could have been dangerous, as always, while Jack goofed off just like he usually did. I mostly spent my time watching the others. I was just happy we could hang around like old times. "I think it's time to go then," George said. "We will be running out of daylight any minute now." We turned to leave, but as we did, I saw Jack fall to the floor out of the corner of my eye. I turned towards him and saw that he was saying something as he writhed on the ground. "Jack, this isn't funny," George said. However, I didn't think that Jack was faking it. I knelt down by him and realized that he was saying the song. It was then that the same thing happened to Mary. She fell to the floor and began writhing, almost as if she were having a seizure. She kept saying something, but it was difficult to make out. All I could understand was the song over and over again. It was then that I saw it. Right there, by the entrance, was a pale figure. I thought it was a woman based on the jet black hair that fell to her waist. Her hair covered most of her face, and she was dressed in a milk-white robe. George turned my head so I was looking at him instead of her and said, "Banshee, Banshee." The spirit of a woman whose wailing was an omen of death. "What do we do?" I asked. "We need to get out," George said as he went to help Jack up. I did the same with Mary, and George was looking for an alternate exit with his eye on a nearby window. "There," he said. However, the moment he said so, the figure appeared right there in front of the window to block our escape. I could feel the floorboards vibrating underneath my feet due to what it was doing. Now, even George fell to the ground, crying and weeping. I looked at the Banshee. I had no idea how to get rid of one, but I had heard that, in general, evil entities and especially the undead hated fire. It had a sunken, rotting face, but I could still make out that it was surprised by the fact that I was standing and not rolling on the floor like my friends. In response to this, her mouth moved more rapidly, and the frequency at which the floorboards under me were vibrating increased. I wouldn't let that stop me, though. I gripped the piece of burning wood and thrust it at her, igniting a part of her hair. She caught fire as if she had been bathed in kerosene beforehand and was immediately enveloped in flames. She disappeared after that, but not before ripping out a part of the wall. I saw the roof cave in over me, and then there was blackness. I came back some time later with my head throbbing. It was night now, and the lights of an ambulance in the distance told me that some people had come to rescue us. Someone was standing above me, but I could only faintly make out their silhouette. He or she was saying something I couldn't make out. "Sorry, can you please turn on a light?" I told the person, "It's too dark to tell what you're saying." I realized what I was saying must have sounded insane, and so I clarified what I said. "I had an accident a few years ago. I'm completely deaf in both ears. I am good at reading lips, though." Thankfully, everyone else survived with nothing more than a few minor injuries. The official story was that the place caved in because it was so old, and none of us brought up what we had seen to the authorities. None of us would have believed them. I found out later that the other members of my group began seeing images of death the moment they heard the song. Not only of themselves but of close family members and friends. This completely overwhelmed them, and they were unable to do anything but listen to it. Not only that, but listening to the song was physically painful. Mary described it as having a migraine but 1,000 times worse, something she would be familiar with given that she had suffered from them earlier in her life. If they had listened to it for any longer, they all probably would have had something like an aneurysm and died. A banshee's wail is usually said to be an omen of death, but I think the one we ran into was far more malevolent. It didn't just want to foretell our deaths, it wanted to trap us and kill us right there and then. My hearing is still the same as always, but I'm less upset about that now. After all, if it weren't for that, none of us would have gotten out of there alive. But I'd certainly advise all of you to be careful, especially while exploring abandoned areas. I'm an engineer. First of all, I wasn't alone. I had a former colleague with me. I told him one day that my brother had been to this abandoned farmhouse and experienced ghostly events. Needless to say, we didn't really believe it. However, we were intrigued because I wasn't convinced my brother was lying. Anyway, the story my brother told me prior to us visiting this place was that he was exploring it with his partner at the time, and she asked him, "Do you think this place is haunted?" while they were in the house. Apparently, when she said it, the entire house shook. Yeah, right. So, one day me and my friend or colleague were at my place, and he suggested we take a trip up there as we had nothing else to do. It was the middle of the day, bright and sunny, good weather. When we arrived, you could hear the wind, the sheep baaing, birds, etc. as we approached the vicinity of the abandoned farmhouse. However, it went completely silent. Almost deafeningly so, so much so that I thought I could hear a kind of slight high-pitched hum. We both commented on the silence. Then, after maybe 20 or 30 seconds of just standing there, out of the adjacent building, which is a kind of barn or something with big open side walls, a flock of crows flew out. As if they were disturbed by something. It was ridiculous, like a cliché scene from a horror movie. We thought it was a weird coincidence, but maybe kind of funny at the time. Anyway, we approached the house and opened the door. The building must have been abandoned for at least half a century. It felt weird and unnaturally quiet. The stuff in there is very old, maybe from around the time of World War II. The smell of mold and dampness was pretty strong. Anyway, my colleague and I explored all of the downstairs rooms, and then we went upstairs. Now, I decided to stay in sight of the front door at all times because we didn't know if we were trespassing. The stairs are right in front of the front door, so I stood at the top of the stairs so I could still see the front door as he explored. After a while, he came back and was standing beside me, looking into one of the adjacent rooms. And then we both hear a sound. It was very clearly the sound of a boot scraping the floor and kicking something downstairs. So, just a sound, no big deal maybe, but nothing could have made that sound. No one was there. We left, and my colleague even told me he expected to see someone downstairs as he did. I explained to him that I was watching the door at all times and that no one could have possibly been in there. We explored every room. Neither of us can explain it. It's been bothering me for a long time, we just don't know what to make of it. What I've told you is the truth, it did happen, so make of it what you will. So this happened sometime in February. I recently just got out of a psych ward a few days prior to this story taking place, but there's this house on this hill, and it's an absolutely gorgeous house. Around 3,000 square feet, I'd say, including a basement and an attic, so around 4 total floors. One day I was bored and decided to go on a walk over to this hill. At the time, I didn't even know where this house was situated, I just knew the hill and wanted to go on a walk, so I went. So I get to the hill, and I see just how ducking steep it is, and I groan but go up. Now this hill isn't that bad to walk up, at the time, I assumed it would be horrible. So I'm walking up this hill, and it's forested on the right side, as the left side had a bunch of houses, so I'm walking up the hill on the right side. It's night by this point, like pitch black, and as I'm walking, I'm just looking around, not seeing a whole lot. Eventually I reach the house and actually almost walk past it as I couldn't see it at first, and proceed to say I remember when this was being built and when people lived in it. Now I'm huge on urban exploration and exploring super abandoned places, so I saunter on in, just driven by curiosity, and it looks like a bomb went off. Floors are rotten, just piles and piles of debris and a bunch of other shit. The owners left a bunch of their mail. I would eventually find a Peppa Pig plushie, and this Thomas the Tank Engine sound wheel, but it looked like they just panicked, left their shit, and left. The attic had a bunch of trash and suitcases as well. As I'm walking around, I eventually reach the living room, and there's this green plastic lawn chair, and it was noticeably colder than everything else. Keep in mind that it's maybe 50 degrees Fahrenheit out, and this house felt like someone was blasting the air conditioning at max for hours, whereas outside it felt like stepping into a swamp. But I didn't think much of that. As I stood back up, I heard this metallic clang, like a pipe or something, so I tried to recreate it and kicked this piece of metal near me, and it made a totally different sound, so it wasn't me accidentally kicking something, but ultimately I couldn't debunk it, so I moved on, and I eventually heard footsteps from the attic, like someone wearing heavy mud boots. Thump. Thump. Now mind you, there's nothing in the attic that can make any sort of sound, same as the basement, and upon hearing this, I was beyond interested and even went up top to check it out, but obviously found nothing, so I couldn't debunk that either, so eventually I left. Like an hour later, after only hearing one other thing happen, it sounded like tapping against a metal pipe, either that or dripping water, which was weird as the house very obviously did not have any utilities. But I leave, and as I am walking down the hill, I see this large white mass move very quickly off to my left. Now it's pitch black, but I snap my head to it before anything can happen, and all I get is the feeling of being watched, which had happened in the house when I was in the kitchen. I felt watched from over by the, I assume, son's bedroom, but not by a child's gaze, an adult's. But me and this white mass more or less make eye contact for a few seconds, then I just decide to cross the street and leave. I did some digging on that property, and every owner only lived there for 2 to 4 years before leaving. The 2 most recent seem to have vanished off of the site's database. There was no contact information, no new address, nothing. Recently, when I went in there alone, there was a painting of something, it was hard to make out what it was of, and a Curious George book on the counter. Then, me and a friend went to the house to hang out in their car just so we could be in a kind of tucked away space, and they said to me that they saw this shadow figure coming straight at them when they went to go take a piss. So my family used to work at a factory behind the cemetery in Riverside, Illinois. There are many stories I have from there, but one that stands out is this one. My parents would take me to this factory, and I'd be there exploring when I was 7 years old. One day, a kid from another family that used to work there, my sister, and I were going to go explore the cemetery because what else were we supposed to do? So my sister went to use the bathroom before we departed, and the bathrooms were all the way in the back of the factory, so we all waited for her. At the time, she was a huge tomboy, so it was weird for her to wear pink. She goes in and comes out 2 minutes later, dressed in full pink and girly clothes. When I asked her why she changed, she said she didn't and insisted that she didn't, and she was wearing that when she went into the bathroom. I usually pat my sister on the shoulder when we head out. When I went for the shoulder pat, she dodged and said she didn't want to be touched, and I was like, cool, cool. As soon as we were about to leave, my sister said she forgot something in the bathroom and went back in. 2 seconds later, my actual sister comes out wearing what she originally wore. When we asked her how she changed so fast, she was confused and thought we were ducking with her. We ran so far away from the bathroom that the other kid and I realized what had happened. About 2 years ago, my sister brought it up and said when she was in the bathroom, she felt like someone was watching her, and when she got out, she saw something duck into the men's bathroom. In a small, sleepy town nestled amidst rolling hills, there was a dilapidated Victorian house that stood abandoned at the edge of the woods. Locals whispered tales of its haunting, claiming that the house was home to the spirits of children who had met unfortunate fates long ago. Legend has it that a young family once resided there, their lives filled with joy and laughter. However, tragedy struck when a devastating fire engulfed the house one night, trapping the innocent children inside. The town mourned their loss, and the charred remains of the house stood as a grim reminder of the lives lost too soon. Years passed, and the stories of the child ghosts grew more vivid. People claimed to have seen flickering lights and heard laughter emanating from the house. The town's children would dare each other to approach the eerie place at dusk, exchanging spine-chilling tales of encounters with the departed children. One evening, a young girl named Emily decided to unravel the mysteries surrounding the house. She had heard the tales whispered among her friends. Emily ventured into the woods, her footsteps careful and deliberate. As the sun began its descent, casting an orange glow over the landscape, she approached the abandoned Victorian house. The creaking floorboards and the overgrown vines clinging to the walls added to the eerie atmosphere. Emily pushed open the rusted front door. Inside, she found a world frozen in time, a place of forgotten dreams and lost innocence. Cobwebs adorned the corners, and dust danced in the rays of light that filtered through the cracked windows. She explored each room, feeling a peculiar presence. In a forgotten corner, she stumbled upon an old, worn-out teddy bear. As she picked it up, a soft giggle echoed through the house, and Emily's fear transformed into warmth and understanding. She realized that the child's spirits had never meant harm. Instead, they longed for connection, for someone to remember them, and for their stories to be told. Moved by compassion, Emily began visiting the house regularly, bringing fresh flowers to place on the windowsill. Over time, the town started to see the abandoned house with new eyes. No longer a place of dread, it became a symbol of resilience, love, and remembrance. The child ghosts, once restless and unseen, found solace in the presence of Emily and the town's growing appreciation for their memory. For years, I had been obsessed with the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. So, when my group of friends suggested we explore the place one night, I jumped at the opportunity. The asylum's history was known to all. It was a place where society's outcasts were sent to be forgotten. As we explored the decaying hallways, we came across the ghostly figure of a nurse. At first, we thought it was just our imagination, but then we came across her again, smiling wickedly at us. I tried to rationalize the encounter, thinking it was just a trick of the light. But by the third time we encountered her, I knew there was something else going on. This was not just a figment of our imagination. We began to hear whispers and muffled screams, and we knew that we weren't alone in the asylum. We decided to turn around and leave. But when we turned around, the ghostly nurse was standing there, staring at us with cold, dead eyes. Without warning, she lunged towards us, letting out a blood-curdling scream. Panic set in as we tried to flee the building, but as we reached the exit, we discovered the door was locked. We had no choice but to keep exploring to find another exit. As we continued to explore, we noticed that things were becoming even more strange and surreal. The walls seemed to be closing in, and the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. Then we saw her again. We ran as quickly as possible, and the ghostly nurse's blood-curdling scream echoed throughout the halls, sending shivers down our spines. We could feel her cold breath on our necks as we sprinted towards what we thought was a dead end. But then there was a glimmer of hope, a door at the end of the hall. With the nurse right behind us, we threw open the door and slammed it shut, trapping her on the other side. As we caught our breath and tried to calm our racing hearts, we realized we were locked in a small room with no obvious way out. After searching frantically for a few minutes, we stumbled upon an old diary hidden away in the corner. We decided to open it up to see if there are any clues to help us escape. We flipped through the pages, and we discovered that the old diary belonged to a nurse who had worked in the asylum during its darker days. Sarah had started working there with the best of intentions, wanting to help those who were less fortunate. But she soon discovered the true nature of this particular institution. Many of the people in there were not even insane but had been committed for reasons like being rebellious or being in debt. Sarah tried to speak out against the abuses, but her concerns were dismissed by the higher-ups at the asylum. But she knew the truth and couldn't keep silent. She began to keep a diary, documenting the atrocities she witnessed. She hoped that one day her words would be heard and that the world would know the truth about the asylum. Unfortunately, her diary was discovered. She was fired from her job, her life was destroyed, and she was left with nothing. On the last page, we learn that she was eventually committed to the same asylum. As I read Sarah's diary, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness and anger. Then we realized it was Sarah who was chasing us. When we closed the diary, the door to the room slowly opened, and Sarah stood before us, smiling. It was as if she wanted us to know her story, to rediscover her diary, and to let the world know of the atrocities that had taken place. And then, just as suddenly, she vanished before our eyes. As we stumbled out of the asylum, we were different than when we had entered. The horrors we witnessed left an indelible mark on us. We went in there looking for thrills, thinking we were going to be scared by ghosts or monsters. But the true monsters are not the ones with fangs or claws. The sun was just starting to rise as we walked away from the asylum. We knew we had a responsibility to share Sarah's story and shed light on the darkness that can so easily take hold in the world. About 8 or so years ago, I lived in a town in the mountains that had a lot of vacant and abandoned houses. I had gone into 2 of them. The first one I went into honestly scared me. It was off a stone road, with a few other houses scattered down the road. My boyfriend at the time and I drove there even though it was less than a mile from where we lived. It had snowed a lot, and there was probably a good 8 inches of snow on that lot. The house was set back from the road and had a long driveway. There were no steps to get into the front door, so we went to the side. The door was already kicked in and snow was blowing from the inside. The house was completely gutted. We went in, and there were those really tall Jesus candles you can get from places like the dollar store lining the hallway on both sides. They had to be close to 100 in total, and we went up the stairs to the front door, continued up the other steps, and stopped in front of a door a little to the right of the kitchen, which was at the top of the steps. There was heavy plastic, like layers. It was thick, acting as a door, so we couldn't see into the room. We decided to go check it out, so we pushed the plastic aside to go in. The room was small, and there was a small folding table set up in the middle of the room with 1 chair, 1 plate on the table, 1 fork, 1 spoon, and 1 cup knocked over. The room's air felt very heavy, as if whoever was there, or was there last, was very depressed and sad and maybe even took their life there, but there were no signs of that. There was no other furniture in the room. There was a closet door that was ajar, but we heard a noise come from behind it. Thinking it was an animal or something, we opened the door, and there was a black top hat on a hook and nothing else. I started to get really bad anxiety, and the heaviness of the air was getting to me. We walked out of the room through the heavy plastic, and I stopped at the top of the steps as my ex wanted to go down the hall, but I was getting too creeped out, so I told him to hurry up. He was maybe 10 steps down the hall when the plastic from the doorway flew open, and I felt this big, forceful rush of air go past me and down the steps. It almost knocked me over. My ex heard the plastic move and ran towards me. He pretty much picked me up. I'm not a skinny person, and we ran down the steps and out the door back to my car. It was terrifying. That plastic could not have moved on its own. I live in Scotland, so it's rare to get a good warm day, and this was a warm day in the summer, so hot you needed a drink. Me and my friend were walking in the woods, and the trees were green with the sun shining brightly, and we were on an adventure. I think I was around 15 to 16 at the time, but we got the idea to go over a bridge that went over a river in our town and explore the path that goes under the other side of the viaduct, an old stone railway bridge in our town. And while walking we came to one of the supports of the bridge and there was an old mattress and just junk laying around. After looking at it we continued walking and I just felt a strong need to turn around, and I can't explain why. It was just one of those times where your body looks somewhere, and I saw this thing. It didn't really have a shape. To describe its shape I'd need to say the most accurate imagine would be like a large black trash bag, but anyway it was transparent and I could see through it, but it was dark and foggy even though I could see the trees behind it. It slowly drifted to the right and faded away as it did. I was captivated by it for about 2 seconds, but standing there it seemed like 5. I then turned around and asked my friend, and he had somehow not seen it as he was looking in front of us and not behind us. I think I will always remember this because it was the only time I actually witnessed something for a good amount of time. My second story is about shadow people or creatures. My dad was out of the country, and a couple of days later I was going to stay at my friend's house. He lives at the bottom of a hill, and I live at the top, so we agreed to meet halfway. We meet up and are walking to his house, and we suddenly just stop, and I am like, whoa, did you see that? And he looks at me and says, yeah, but I didn't want to seem like I was being stupid, and we both just sort of describe it at the same time. We saw it run past a fence and behind a nursery. It looked like a small, skinny man, like the height of a small dog or maybe taller, and it had an arched back, and the way it ran reminded me of a goblin. My friend then told me a story about how, before he had started walking up the hill, he had been talking to his mother about something, and he saw it behind her and was really confused by it. We were sort of freaked out, but we decided to call it Bob just because, in our logic, it was funny and wasn't scary. That night, we went for a walk in the woods, and it was so dark we couldn't even see, and then when we came out from the trees, the clouds had made a skull. It was overall just a strange night.